For our final session, we have excellent speakers continuing on our momentum here. Next up is William Casebeard. He's a project manager with DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Please help welcome Bill Casebeard.
Hear me in the back? Is this functioning? Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction, John. I appreciate the invitation to speak at the conference. So thank you, Matt. I appreciate it, Wendell. It's been a lovely couple of days. I'm going to pull a little bit of a bait switch. So tomorrow was kind enough to mention that I was going to be talking some about the neurobiology of habit formation. And I have a briefing prepared on that topic, but I realized over the course of the last day that briefing would essentially have been some ungodly love child of what would happen if you combine Bill, Molly, Wendell, and Jay's talks. So rather than rehearse some of that ground, I'll give you a 30-second précis of that talk, and then press into a different presentation that Trolley and Territory we haven't covered yet, just for the purpose of keeping things lively. So the thesis of that presentation was that if we take the risk-utility notions of character development seriously, that at least one thing that character development institutions do is they need to identify the difference between good practice and bad practice of the virtues. And then if we look at neurobiology of moral judgment, we might be able to quantify and understand the context sensitivity of the distinction between good practice and bad practice. And if we do that, we'll find ourselves tending closer to the institutional environment in which moral action takes place, so that we can understand things like why at the military service academies, for instance, a lot of the violations of the honor code occur because of the lack of sleep. And then we can insulate people against the effect of those kinds of environmental influences by giving them better time management skills. And then reversely, neurobiology might provide some insight into how we make that process more efficient. So that's that talk. I want to do something. What we're going to do now is talk about the relationship between neuroethics, broadly construed, and issues in national security. Since I think Jim and I are, James Giordano and I are probably going to be the only ones who will speak to these issues in the conference. And I would argue that neuroscience technology offers lots of promise and lots of peril in the national security domain, and that it cuts across all three individuals pictured here. So the individual to your left is a Torek. I took this picture several years ago when I was roaming around the Pan-Sahel region. So this is a region in the central belt of Africa, rugged terrain. This ethnic group has conflicts with the governments of some of the nations in the area, such as that of Mali, with regard to resource distribution. So this gentleman here is going to have to make some decisions. Does he put in his lot with the Alliance for Democratic Change, a Tory group that wants to engage the central government of Mali in a peaceful fashion so as to foment political change? Or does he put in his lot with a group that used to be called the GSPC? That's the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat. So you have a love group with a very forthright name like that. It tells you what we're going to do. We're going to preach to you about the Salafi, the contains of the Prophet. If you don't like that, we'll kill you. Okay? And that group has since relabeled itself, and they are now called Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb. So who that disaffected Malian youth throws his lot in with, I would argue, is going to be conditioned by the narratives and stories that respected elders and others, peers as well, whom he interacts with day in and day out. And that some of those narratives and stories are going to influence his neurobiology in ways that affects fundamental moral distinctions he will make, such as whom he thinks it is permissible to kill to achieve a political aim. All right, so neuroscience can offer insights into that process, and may even offer us technologies that we can use to kind of creatively think about that ecology. Here's another individual who will be impacted. This is somebody with the Ohio National Guard who's deployed in Helmand province in Afghanistan in this case. The highest figure I've ever seen with regards to deployed combat forces is that almost 49% of them return with at least pre-clinical symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I've also seen figures as high as the high 20s for people who have clinical DSM-4 diagnosable symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, being downrange, being involved in conflict has psychological impact that neuroscience can help us understand and address. The process of forming memory, recalling and consolidating it, takes place in a temporally extended fashion, such that within the first 24 hours it might be possible to design an intervention that prevents the migration of AMPA receptors that have to kind of move up the axon of a neuron and make their way up the synaptic cleft so as to be able to affiliate the experience to lay down the memory. If we can disrupt that process, perhaps we could, in a sense, immunize soldiers against some aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's at least a possibility. On the flip side, we might also be able to give the soldier a neuroscience-oriented technology that lets them deal with the dramatic amounts of information they have to process in order to be able to carry out their mission. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Finally, this individual also is going to be impacted by neuroscience technology. So this baby is an MAOA mutant. So what that means is that on the tail end of the Y chromosome for this young male boy, there was a mistake in crossover such that a segment of the genome that codes for the production of monoamine oxidase A has been deleted. And it turns out that MAOA is a critical chemical that lets you, it's an enzyme that codes for a set of chemical reactions that help you catalyze serotonin, right? It eats serotonin in the brain. So if you are an MAOA mutant, you may have problems catalyzing serotonin, and as a result, depending on the distribution of serotonin receptors in the brain, you can have pathologies that come from being unable to regulate serotonin, something that Molly talks a lot more about. One thing I would point out about this baby is you can immediately think, of course, the therapeutic-oriented interventions that might prevent MAOA mutants from constituting the majority of the criminals in the California prison system, for instance. I know that empirical findings are able, but nonetheless, aside from those therapeutic interventions, there are also larger public policy upshot that comes from thinking about the epigenomic interactions that influence the expression of the gene. So neuroscience-oriented technologies aren't just about developing pills or liquids or augmenting technologies. They may also help you design an ecosystem that might prevent the expression of neurobiologically important genes. And John Cacioppo has done some lovely work, for instance, where he's shown these interesting interaction effects between critical breakpoints in your development as a child and the expression of the MAOA gene. So in other words, it's not sufficient that you merely possess the chopped off tail end of the Y chromosome, but also you have to be able to use it at certain points in your development. And we might be able to squeeze public policy advice, pay special attention. I mean, of course, we should always be concerned about child abuse, but pay special attention to it in these cases because of its downstream epigenomic effects that are neuroscientifically salient. So what I'll quickly do for about the next 13 or 14 minutes is give you some definitions of neuroethics to help set the stage for this discussion. I want to talk about the links between between a neuroscience-oriented national security technology and the radicalization process. That will lead to a brief discussion of just war theory, which is a tool that we have in our applied ethics toolkit that we use to regulate the application of force in the battlefield. And I want to argue that because of its connection to traditional ethical principles, we might also be able to use some of those same questions to help us regulate the application of neuroscience-oriented technologies in the battlefield. Now, even so, there are still lots of concerns presented by the changing context of the battlefield, and I'll briefly address those. At the end of the day, my position here is a pragmatic one. I want to comfort the afflicted, right? Those who foresee some type of Borgesian or more Wiccan disaster coming about because of the use of neuroscience in the security domain. But I also want to afflict the comfortable by pointing out some of the problematic considerations that arise. Ultimately, I'm an optimist, and I want to convince you that you should too, or at least that's not crazy to be an optimist in the face of this technology. So here's some preliminaries. First of all, what do we mean by ethics? This is a sophisticated audience, so I don't need to spend much time in these next 2 or 3 slides. Something like the science of norms in a weak sense, an organized body of knowledge about what we have to do or think or about what kind of people we ought to be. That's normally captured by the big 3 moral theories that we hear about in any survey course. So for the neuroscientists or engineers among you, right, you may have had to suffer through an ethics course in your undergraduate education, and you almost certainly talked about virtue theory, deontology, utility. The first day and a half of the conference will be focused on Kant here is an exemplar, and Mill is an exemplar here. Even though a lot of the speakers did start by talking about Aristotle and Plato, we didn't get too much normative purchase with them initially. It seemed like I'm very happy to see that we turn that corner today. And can see the usefulness of virtue theory in helping us think about neuroethics. So really all the big pre-moral theories do is capture our intuitions that in any morally problematic situation there are three angles of analysis that you can bring to bear. Namely, that you have an agent doing something that has certain effects, and we can evaluate all three of those slices. The agent, virtue theoretic concerns, the thing that is done, the structure of the action, doing something, and finally the effects of the action, the utility of the action. Now, in the neuroethics literature, there are normally three senses that we talk about. We talk about the application of neuroscience to a problem. So it's really a question of applied ethics that the bioethicists among us are extremely well qualified to practice. And there are also interesting relationships between neuroscience and moral reasoning that might give us insight into the epistemology of morality, how we come to know moral facts, are there such things as moral facts, and the ontology of morality. Are the entities posited as parts of, say, our moral psychology by the various moral theories? Do they actually exist? So neuroethics, then, is the systematic study of how the cognitive neurosciences interact with, in our case today, especially applied ethics, moral epistemology, and moral ontology to produce innovations in all three fields. I today am going to draw the applied ethics aspects and the national security sense. The actions we take individually and collectively to defend ourselves, and I'm fully aware that we there is a loaded term and to deflect and to go in Derrida's direction. So I understand that we have political issues we need to resolve here. Don't read too much into this. All right, now I want to drive home the importance of neuroscience for helping us understand security issues by looking at, in part, the radicalization process. So here's a case study for you. The process that turns an individual into a member of an armed, non-state organization usually involves inputs, things like resource scarcity, demographic pressures, the presence of organized crime and corruption, and identity cleavages, that is, splits between in-groups and out-groups that can be exploited, usually by an identity entrepreneur, somebody who takes these inputs and acts on them so as to mobilize the given population. There are also failures of governance that often result whenever a newly constituted government fails to discharge its duties to its citizens. And those two things can feed those inputs to eventually produce some kind of violent non-state organization. Of course, the loop doesn't stop then. There are reinforcing actions that both the nation organization and the nation state take. These are explored in the popular literature and things like the movie V for Vendetta, right, based on the Alan Moore comic book, which very nicely details the process of the mobilization of a violent social movement in the face of heavy-handed crackdowns by not organized government. All I want to point out is that this systemic process is shot through with concerns that cognitive neuroscience can shed light on, ranging from the impact of our environment, resource scarcity, on the mechanisms that we use to reason about who is a member of our group and whom isn't, whom we can harm and whom we can't, demographic pressures that may lead to radical changes in identity cleavages, for instance. So if we look at the radicalization problem, it generally doesn't stem from a relatively well-constituted polity. It generally stems from diaspora communities who find themselves dislocated and separated from traditional mechanisms of cultural support, especially second-generation members of some of those diaspora communities. And all of these processes, I would also argue, we can get insight into how they occur by examining cognitive neuroscience. So maybe even something as deep as identity, how something like a narrative or a story influences identity would be a critical subject of concern. And to motivate that, I think all we have to do is get back to Josh Green's presentation from 2 days ago. This is from Green's original paper in Science in 2001, where he did his first very well-known experiments in the trolley versus footbridge problem. I won't rehearse this again since you all know well. I just want to point out one thing, that the difference between personal and impersonal moral scenarios is a difference in narrative, right? 3 or 4 sentences that deliver to you a different story that activate radically different neural structures, some implicated in working memory, and hence which incline you toward consequential reasoning, and others which implicate emotional regions, theory of mind-oriented regions, which push you towards thinking about the interpersonal nature of your interaction and towards the ontology. Right? Stories influence the mechanisms you bring online to make a moral judgment, and in this case, fundamental moral judgment. Whom do you have permission to kill? All right, so you can see why, just a foot stomp, why I think Green's work is illustrative here about the importance of stories for influencing moral judgment. That's important for national security. Now, if we're going to systematically study then how stories might influence things like moral judgment, we need the theory of story. So here's one. This comes from Gustav, Freytag, a 19th century German writer. He regurgitated and warned over Aristotle from the Poetics, who said that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. A setup that rises to a climax, that relaxes to a resolution, usually involves a struggle between a protagonist and an antagonist, where the protagonist is normally an in-group member and the antagonist is normally an out-group member. In fact, if you look at hyperactive political tropes in propaganda, for instance, they embody Freytag triangle-style structures. For example, a comprehensive examination of television commercials on Hezbollah's TV station Al-Manar reveals that they have interesting setup, climax, resolution style tendencies. There's one that shows the events of the early 1930s and 1940s, and it tells you neo-colonial powers unjustifiably established the State of Israel. The climax of the commercial is we, the Palestinians, resist violently, and the resolution of the commercial is Israel is pushed to the sea in the 21st century. That 3 to 4 sentence story does a lot for you in your cognitive economy. It tells you who you want to empathize with, who you want not to empathize with. It suggests certain fixed action patterns that you might use in a struggle against the oppression that's been done to you, and it frames the environment in which you swim in terms of a justice-oriented issue. Look at what the outcomes have done to us. The only way you can respond with violence. And so we see some of these tropes and themes reflected even in other domains. For instance, I took this photograph outside of the John Mosque in Bamako. So this is seen by about 20,000 people each day as they go into the mosque for worship. And I know my photography is bad. Does anybody recognize this scene? It was actually an Atlantic article about this scene. This is Muhammad al-Dura and his father. And in 2001, Muhammad al-Dura was a Palestinian youth who was shot, some say, by the Israeli Defense Forces unjustifiably. Right? So this is a touchstone story for Palestinian resistance. There's no caption. All it is a single still, a visual image that immediately suggests for audiences who are familiar with the story whom they ought to be empathizing with here, Muhammad al-Dura and his father, even though there is no real connection culturally between the peoples of West Africa and the Palestinians. So there's a Soviet consciousness being developed here that I would argue is being bridged by a story or narrative. Now, as we turn then to think about what kind of neuroscience-oriented technologies we can develop that might help us think about the radicalization process and how we disrupt it, there might be some alarm bells that are going off in your head, right? And justifiably so, right? We need to tread cautiously on this type of ground. But as we do this, we aren't at sea in a sieve. Okay, we have some resources in our toolkit. I would open up the applied ethics toolbox, grab out a screwdriver, a wrench, and so on. And in this case, I would start at least here, just north here, are traditional tools that we use to evaluate when I can apply certain tools on the battlefield. And of course, we split just war considerations between use ad hoc and justice at the war itself. Here's the traditional questions we ask. And use in both, that is the actions that we take inside of the war, whether those can be justified. And if you look down this list, a lot of these questions and tests advert to the traditional questions, the big three moral theories that I talked about earlier, advert to. So in a sense, all we're doing is revisiting in an applied scenario those three major moral theories, except we're using them to guide questions we have about use of force in the battlefield. So we can ask not just about the use of force in the battlefield, but about other technologies in the battlefield as well. How they fare against those kind of big three tools that resulted in the screwdriver, wrench, and so on being in our toolbox. So I think we can keep in mind the 3 C's, in other words: character, consent, consequence. That's how I capture in an amateurish fashion the types of questions we need to ask about a neuroscience-related technology. Does using the technology make us less functional as human beings, or would it have us develop bad character traits? So virtues and vices are canonical here. On the Kantian front, consent. Does the subject of the technology consent, and I know that's a term, implicit, explicit consent, and so on, to having it used, rights and duties are paramount considerations here. And finally, consequence. Do the good consequences of using the technology outweigh the bad consequences? This is just a straightforward regurgitation of Mill's greatest happiness principles. So these three C's capture a lot of the moral concerns we might have about applying a neuroscience theory technology on the biologized battlefield. Sometimes they do provide us a tool for resolution. We'll find they all agree, right? And they all tell you ought not to take a particular action with the don't use of a particular technology. In other cases, they won't, and we'll have tough moral reasoning to do. Now, keep in mind that as we apply these tools to biologized battlefield, there are some differences between new warfare and old warfare, between mechanized industrial warfare and, say, the types of counterinsurgency operations that are being conducted in Afghanistan and Iraq. Here are some of them. First of all, the combatant and non-combatant distinction has become even more problematized. It's oftentimes difficult for our soldiers to tell who's legally constituted combatant and who isn't. Moreover, the decisions they have to make have been accelerated. So Colonel John Boyd articulated this thing called OODA loop. You observe, orient, decide, and act in a particular circumstance, and if you can do that faster than your adversary, then you'll probably prevail on the battlefield. But the OODA loop for a contemporary soldier has been accelerated. That in turn boosts the chances of unintended consequences and complicates appropriate force questions. So life on the 21st century battlefield is going to be more complicated as a result. But these differences are ones of degree, not of kind. This isn't a radical change in terms of the nature of warfare. So what I'll end up in my last minute and a half of my presentation is just briefly addressing generic concerns you might have about national security or in neuroscience technologies, and some responses and considerations. You may say, hey, on the empirical front, these things are going to reduce human flourishing. For example, what about memory medication? So you mentioned the use of therapeutic that might help prevent PTSD. Might that also have unintended downstream consequences for the natural, quote-unquote, mechanisms we use otherwise to cope with traumatic experience? And that is certainly something we need to keep in mind. You can picture something like a Warwickian disaster occurring. Kevin Warwick was a gentleman from the UK who augmented his body with biological apparatus. He implanted a sensor in his arm at the door of his house and so on. And you can extend this into a cyber-like realm that ought to give us pause with regards to the character process. Their nature is so radically changed that they're no longer recognizably human. On the consent front, you may be worried that we might be dehumanized by the use of these technologies, especially when we're used without the consent of those affected. And I think we have homely examples of this in the neuromarketing side of the house, where Freytag Neuromarketing and others are using neuroscience to tutor the efficacy of messages that are delivered less as commercials. And we have justifiable concerns about added distance brain manipulation, if you will. And those might eventually cause something like the Burgessian disaster. So that's just a reference to Clockwork Orange, which you saw earlier. And finally, on the consequence side, maybe we may lose net pain by using these. Maybe we'll make it more and more likely as a result. Will there not be unintended consequences of something like a pain management technology that our soldiers adopt? You can even imagine a scenario where this is wrapped around a nanotechnology where you have a reproduction issue such that at the end of the day you have some catastrophic grade new disaster that results in the entire surface of the earth being covered to a decade feet with an out-of-control nanotechnology. So I just want you to keep in mind that all those scenarios in the far right are all fictional. Right? None of them happened yet. Perhaps with the exception of climate change, I would argue that our organizations are generally adapting enough that they likely will happen. Also keep in mind these facts. So we are manipulating each other's neural states, and I don't mean that in a nefarious sense. At multiple entry points and multiple scales. So my appearance results in a change of a state for you. The way I present myself results in a change of state. If I touch you for more than 15 seconds, endogenous oxytocin production will go up in your brain, and that will result in modulation of trust-related judgments and so on. So again, differences of degree, not of kind. And moreover, in an adversarial situation where other nation states and other non-state entities might be researching this exact same science, if we're to defend ourselves against intrusions into our autonomy, we need an understanding of the basic mechanisms responsible for influence and how those are incorporated into the brain. Restraint itself does sometimes pose strategic risks in a competitive environment. And so, for that reason, the precautionary principle itself, while generally praiseworthy in biomedical context, is not without risk in a competitive security environment. None of this is to we shouldn't have democratic oversight of the use of these technologies in the battlefield, and that we might even have internationally constituted democratic oversight of these technologies. Don't have time to get into that today. I just want to point out that we do need oversight, and that no set of choices is without risk, especially with regard to making our institutions accountable.
Our next speaker is Sitaram. He comes to us from Southwestern Medical Center, University of Texas.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great conference, and it's really a pleasure to talk about psychopathy again. I want you to keep in mind this is a work in progress. There are some issues about psychopathy just in the psychiatry literature now with the DSM-5. I think the DSM-4 doesn't include psychopathy as an entry in the DSM-5. If you go online, you'll find it under antisocial personality disorder. Most of you will recognize his face, the Joker in the in Batman. And the title is Enhancing Criminal Brains. And I wanted to be ambiguous in my talk, in my title, and hopefully not in the talk. The reason is because I can't remember this morning, somebody raised a question about criminals wanting to have access to this technology. Because if you have psychopathic tendencies, you might want to fit in society and still be a criminal, engage in criminal activity. So here, are we enhancing the brain of criminals so they can become better people and fit in society and treat them? Or do we want to use that technology for these individuals to become better criminals? So I want to, in terms of my title, this is what I wanted to do. And this is why I'm just raising questions. And obviously in 20 minutes, I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to be able only to scratch the surface about the issues we need to address. So, use this. So I want to talk a little bit about defining psychopathy, just for some of you who might not have, we know what a psychopath is, but we need to have a better understanding than just this kind of what the media or popular culture will tell us. Then talk a little bit about the neurobiology of psychopathy, because I was very, the reason why I got interested in psychopathy is because actually I wrote an article criticizing Jay's notion of virtue ethics. That came out last year in Age of Neuroscience, because I thought, how can we engineer virtues? And I was a little bit skeptic, and I'm still a skeptic, but I don't want to be a skeptic like Buchanan would say, the anti-enhancement and all the debate he has in his book. But I was puzzled because, well, obviously everybody wants to improve society, and we want to be better people. And some people might not be able to do so because of particular conditions. And I thought, psychopathy is one of them. So, I'm sympathetic with his work in the idea of, having a better society. But when we talk about virtue engineering, are we talking about morality, or are we talking about controlling the behavior of people? And so this will be my critique of moral enhancement. I think we need clarity in terms of what we mean by morality. And then, then I said, well, okay, it might not be morality, but we could control the behavior of certain individuals. And so I look at what can we do. So I look at psychopharmacology, and then the fMRI brain-computer interface they're developing in Tübingen with Birnbaumer. And so I thought, oh, this is very interesting. So I don't want to say, no, we shouldn't develop, it's not possible. I think, yes, we can use that technology. But it's, again, it's not to enhance their morality. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethical and social implications if we develop these technologies. And here I'm going to raise the questions. I'm now going to give an analysis of these questions. So if we look at prior accounts of psychopathy, we see that people tend to define various scholars, they call it derangements of the moral faculties or moral insanity. So it's very appealing to me just to investigate these notions. Well, moral insanity was this moral disease concept that you addressed. But the current definition is, well, psychopathy is a personality disorder characterized by emotional dysfunction, the inability to have empathy, and antisocial behavior. And then when we look at some statistics, 1 to 2% of the general population is considered has psychopathic traits or is a psychopath. Interestingly, 3.5% of businessmen are considered or have psychopathic traits. But what's key here to remind ourselves is that not all psychopaths are necessarily criminals. So this is why, for me, it's very interesting from a social standpoint. Because if we have true psychopath in society, then the question is, do we have a moral obligation to develop these technology or use the technology available to prevent, treat, diagnose psychopathy in society? We know what happened in Norway, 9/11, and I'm not saying these people are necessarily psychopaths, but do we want to avoid this type of behavior in society and have a better society in general, more people in our society? Now, if we look at treatment, well, so far we're not very successful to treat psychopathy. Pharmacology doesn't help much. Behavioral therapy has a higher rate of recidivism. So this is why I was interested. If there is no treatment, well, maybe psychopharmacology and brain-computer interface might help. And then if you look at the prison population, 15% of male prison individuals are criminal. Criminal psychopaths constitute 15% of male prison population, but these individuals commit 50% more crime than non-psychopathic inmates. So again, here we see that there is a certain utility to develop these technologies, but again, how do we go about in developing these technologies? Now, if you look at the profile of psychopathic individuals, so you look at their, in terms of affective outlook, shallow affect, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, interpersonal, grandiose sense of self-worth, and so forth. But what's very interesting is these people are very charming. Ted Bundy was a law student. Very, very charming. So it's very difficult to detect them. It's very difficult to say, because these individuals have a particular goal. So what you see in their cognitive functions are okay. It's the emotional dimension of their personality that is affected. And I'm going to show you some slides about that. Now, if you look at the neurobiology of basis of psychopathy, it's about neuroanatomy, some dysfunction in brain structure, but it's also about genetics and going back to the checklist. So I think we need to merge the three components to really define if an individual is psychopathic. The danger of using neuroimaging, for example, is to reduce an individual just to what you see in an image, and then the questions about interpretation and so forth. But I'm not going to go that route. But if you look at various studies, for example, And I didn't mention the references, but I could if you're interested. But damage to the orbital frontal cortex can affect affective and cognitive processes essential for moral deliberation. Damage to the anterior cingulate affect the capacity for empathy. This is a big one for psychopathic individuals. And then damage to the amygdala creates difficulties processing various affective stimuli, such as the inability to recognize anger and fear in the face of others. Key here, a psychopath, I mean, if you're suffering, they really don't care. They will not be able to recognize the signals in your face that you're in distress or you're fearful. So here, what I wanted to show you, and again here, I don't want to discuss necessarily these slides, but just to show you, based on the study by Rain and Young, these are the regions most commonly activated in moral judgment in normal individuals. So you have the amygdala and the gyrus and the cingulate and so forth. I understand that the way the brain functions is very complicated. But I want to be able to just make sure that we point to certain parts of the brain, because as we will see in the next slides, certain brain regions are functionally and structurally impaired in antisocial, violent, and psychopathic individuals. And you see there is an overlap between these regions, especially these here, if we go back and forth. And then Rain in his study showed that if you look at the yellow, these are regions common to both antisocial behavior and mental decision-making capacity. So you see that there is an overlap. And this, for me, was very interesting because if you look at the way the brain functions in terms of our capacity to make decisions, and the regions affected in psychopathic individuals, you see some overlap. So, well, and then genetics, as I mentioned, it's the last one, but again, I'm not going to talk too much about that. So, development of treatment options. So, where do we go from there? And so I got interested way back, 2 years back, I was interested in the brain-computer interface. But it was more about bionic arms and these type of questions. But then I came across this fMRI brain-computer interface developed in Germany, in Tübingen, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. And then also psychopharmacology. These are the two that I wanted to talk about. So then we talked about this fMRI brain-computer interface. And here I'm referring to an article by Wim Bauer and colleagues from 2002. And they did a study on criminal psychopath. And what they determined is that there is a deficit in metabolic activity in the fear circuit, which is important for behavioral development. So the idea to use this technology, this fMRI brain computer, is to train, or they want these individuals to learn how to reactivate brain regions implicated in fear conditioning. Now, we could talk about, the technology itself, but I would have to do that more with a neuroscientist to have a really better understanding, and I'm not going to do that. But so they did a little study, and so they had 9 healthy subjects, and they wanted to measure the bold effect, so the vascular response to neuroactivity. And they had 3 sessions of 20 minutes. And what they managed to do, and here we see an increase in bold activity, and here we see also the brains, and we see that this was session 3 and session 1 nothing, and then in session 3 you see that they increased the bold activity. So the idea is to use the same technology. In the article they refer to 3 psychopathic individuals where you see that there is an increase activity in the brain. So I didn't want to talk about it because the way they cut it, it was not very clear whether only 3, I mean, it's statistically not very relevant, so I want to avoid that discussion. But the idea, I mean, if you have 9 healthy subjects, it should work, and so they're developing that technology. Okay, let me move a little bit faster. Then SSRI, in terms of psychopharmacology, there is this study in 2011, came out last year, the effects of sertraline on psychopathic traits. And so the study examined whether sertraline alters psychopathic personality traits in patients with major depressive disorder. I'm not going to talk about the method, just they have a regimen of the SSRI, and then also they have the self-reporting instrument, the psychopathic personality inventory. But the findings are very interesting that SSRI may enhance adaptive psychopathic personality traits such as social charm, which is a trait of psychopath, and interpersonal boldness. SSRIs may reduce maladaptive psychopathic personality traits such as impulsivity and externalization of blame. So these would help criminal psychopaths just to fit into society. But it would help, I mean, if we treat these individuals to remove some of their psychopathic traits. So I find this very interesting, and again, some people at this conference talked about SSRI, so I'm not going to go further into this. So does this study show that we can improve and enhance moral behavior? And I would say no. It would, in my view, it enhances behavior. It controls behavior, but not moral behavior. And I'm going to provide 3 critiques. The first one, I think, it's a misconception of moral psychology. The second one is there's a threat to the very essence of moral agency, what it means to be a moral agent, and then the wrong assumptions about moral neutrality. So the first one is about moral judgment, the second one is about autonomy, and the third one about moral content. So let me move to the first one. If we look at the structure of human moral behavior, we see that our emotions are involved, our volition and our reasoning are involved. So we have affective, motivational, and cognitive processes. When you put the 2 together, more emotions and more reasoning, then we have more judgments. I think what the technology, at least so far, has done, we have emphasized more emotions. I mean, the effect on more emotions. This is why I'm saying that I think we're not enhancing moral behavior, but more we're trying to control behavior. So this is historically, it goes back to Hume and Kant on the role of reason and emotions in morality. But I think we should not see them as being opposed, but rather as working in synergy and influencing each other. And here, this is my colleague, psychiatrist John Sadler. He came up with this distinction between moral capacity and moral content. So moral capacity is the ability to respond morally. It's about our affection, our more emotions. So our more emotions will determine how we behave and how we respond to a moral dilemma. But then you need more content. And more content is what is a point of reference in the way we're going to behave. It's not just the way we behave, it's not just a question of reacting to certain emotions, but these emotions are structured, are influenced by more content. And I think some of you raised the question about the content of morality. It's not just a question of capacity. So if we go back, then the reason why I'm skeptic about this notion of moral enhancement is because this part here, I don't see where the content of morality comes. And I haven't seen anything in the literature showing that we can really influence more reasoning or the content of morality. So then the second predict the threat to the very essence of moral agency. For 1 minute. Okay, I need to go. Quick. Well, it's really about autonomy. So if these technologies influence our moral behavior, but then what about the role of moral deliberation? And this goes back to virtue ethics and the role of moral reasoning. And so it's a question about morality. And here there is a quote, but I'm not going to read it for the sake of time and move forward. And then the third one is the wrong assumption about moral neutrality, that is moral content. I think in the discussions of what I've read about moral enhancement is the lack of this idea that morality is neutral, that there is no content. But as I point out here, we all come from a different background. I'm from Switzerland. I'm a European. I have different assumptions about, let me just a typical case when we compare Europeans and Americans. Americans tend to be more individualistic. Europeans tend to be more communal. And I've been here for 16 years, and I see these differences. And I think we need to include these concepts in our reflection. We don't live in the vacuum, in the moral vacuum, but we come, I mean, if you're a religious person, not religious, if you're a Kantian, and so forth, and so we need to consider that. Stop. Okay, let me, can I have one more minute? Of course. Okay, thank you. So the task ahead of us, I think we see this technology, but we need to anticipate. We need to be proactive and not just say, okay, we're going to develop these technologies and then we're going to stop and scratch our head and say, oh, what have we done? We need to be more proactive in the way we discuss these issues. Ethical issues quickly. I think we need to determine and establish ethical boundaries to enforce the use of these neurotechnology. If we think as a society we have a moral duty and a legal obligation to intervene. And then we need to establish thresholds. You know, how much and what kind of psychopathic traits can or should society tolerate? When is it too much? Maybe some people are eccentric. Maybe they have some, you know, they don't share our moral values. But to what extent, where do we draw the line and say, that's it, now we need to stop and intervene? We have this technology, we're going to do it. And then the question of moral and criminal responsibility. And here there is a debate about whether these individuals, psychopaths, are criminally responsible, deserving punishment and treatment, or whether these individuals are blameless offenders. They just need treatment because they don't understand what they're doing. And then from a societal standpoint, well, I mentioned the moral obligation and legal duty to protect citizens and how we're going to go about if we have that technology. And then, of course, criminal profiling. Unintended consequences. I raised that question with Jay a few days ago. He came after me, and I couldn't respond. It was on a radio show, but it was very interesting, but I still think it's an important question. I'm not saying we shouldn't develop that technology, but we have to think about who's going to have access to that technology and for what purpose. And I think this is my last slide. So I think in our reflection, we need to think about more emotion and more reasoning and how the two work in synergy and how we could, if we could provide content to morality, how the two could be in some ways implemented through technology. I'm still very skeptic. So it's really about the manipulation of more emotions. And here, in my view, morality, at least at this point, unless I see some evidence, is not engineered but developed. And obviously, we need to develop a vision of the good life and understanding of what it means to flourish as a human being. So, thank you.
Our next speaker is Max Norman, comes to us from Case Western University, where he's professor of bioethics and law.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Works? Okay. So despite all of the cynics and the skeptics, I'm going to assume that we have actually developed, or at least that we're doing work on developing a moral enhancement pill. Instead of Lunesta, let's call it Lunesta. And the first question is, how would we research, or what would the ethical rules be for researching a moral enhancement drug? We talked a little bit about this yesterday. One issue is how to balance its risks and benefits. Well, that depends first on what are the expected adverse effects of the drug. And the second question, perhaps, is how well is it expected to work? I'll give you a minute to do the math. And now, when we're talking about enhancement interventions, there's perhaps a kind of tendency to discount the enhancement benefits. And a group of researchers and I had just finished a grant from the NIH in which we looked at the ethical rules for conducting human subjects research on enhancements, and a series of articles, including this one in the American Journal of Bioethics. We concluded that there was no justification for weighing the risks and benefits of enhancement interventions differently from the risks and benefits of health-oriented research. In both health-oriented and enhancement research, we wrote, the potential benefit necessary to justify the risk will depend on the specific interventions being studied. Enhancement benefits are not necessarily of lesser value than health-oriented benefits. But another question is, how will we what process, what mechanism will we use to assess the risks and benefits, to assess the ethical nature of human subjects research on this pill? Will IRBs be able to do the job? Well, one of the problems, if you look at the common rule, is this provision, which says that IRBs should not consider possible long-range effects of applying knowledge gained in the research. For example, possible effects on public policy is among those risks that fall within its purview. This came, as many of you perhaps know, from a concern by social science researchers that if IRBs were concerned about policy issues, they would be skeptical, they would be hostile to certain kinds of social science research, such as on race issues. But nevertheless, this seems to me to create the need for somebody, perhaps somebody else, to be considering these kinds of long-range policy issues. The NIH created the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee to do some of that job for genomic research, and maybe we need a similar body for enhancement research. Special concerns would be raised by Nesta research on vulnerable populations, children, pregnant women, and fetuses, supposing, for example, the pill had to be started in pregnancy, the mentally impaired military members, prisoners, and employees. Let's look at children for a moment. Basically, the current rules say that it's okay to use children as subjects if the risks to them are minimal or less, and if there's a prospect of direct benefit to the subject that balances the risk. Now, the term direct benefit is not defined in the common rule, and health benefits rather than moral enhancements certainly are what the drafters had in mind, but enhancement benefit is also not explicitly excluded. So depending on how you want to take that. Otherwise, there's a section of the common rule that allows children to participate as subjects if a special review panel appointed by the NIH's Office of Human Subjects Research Protections finds that, quote, the research presents a reasonable opportunity for further understanding, prevention, or alleviation of a serious problem affecting the health or welfare of children. Well, would Honesta qualify? Does moral enhancement alleviate a serious problem affecting the welfare of children? Interesting question. Balancing the risks and benefits is not only an issue for Honesta research, but also for the FDA, which would have to decide whether it's appropriate to, given the benefits and the risks, to market the drug widely. Assuming, however, that the drug has been approved and is being marketed, should the law compel anyone to take it? For example, convicted criminals say it's a condition of being paroled, similar to the practice of giving Depo-Provera to sex offenders in order to permit them to leave prison. Of course, why wait for the convicts to be paroled? This is Moral Mouse, and he is going to take Honesta and give it to Bernie Madoff while he's still in prison and transform him into a moral person. For that matter, could the government use its public health powers to require everyone to take Banesto? An analogy would be immunizations. The legal standard for requiring everybody to be immunized was set forth by the Supreme Court in this 1905 case. The basic principle is this is okay if it is a reasonable regulation established to protect the public health and public safety. Would mandatory Banesto use be a reasonable regulation to protect the public health, the health and public safety? Interesting question. An alternative to the government mandating that we all take the drug would be to give us certain incentives to do so. For example, only persons who were taking Banesto would be eligible for certain tax benefits or certain government jobs. What about children? Could parents be required by the law to give children the pill? Could parents who didn't be penalized, for example, regarded as being neglectful under our abuse and neglect laws? Well, if you use immunizations as an analogy, the Supreme Court in 1922, in a case called Gustav versus King, upheld an ordinance prohibiting kids from attending public school without being vaccinated against smallpox. And there are some cases that suggest that parents who prevent their children from attending public school because the parents are refusing to get them immunized, the parents are guilty of abuse and neglect. But there's no reported case that regards the failure to vaccinate per se as neglect. Interesting question. Another question is whether public schools could require kids to take a nest as a condition of attendance, as they do, for example, with regard to immunizations. Well, is moral enhancement analogous to immunization against disease? Well, is limited morality similar to having a limited moral judgment similar to having a communicable disease? Well, it certainly may have adverse effects on the health and welfare of others. And it's interesting to note that schools typically require vaccination against tetanus, which is not communicable. Interesting question. What about private actors? Could employers require employees to take Banesto? This is the head of our Cleveland Clinic who doesn't want to hire anybody who is obese. The state of the law on this kind of thing is that employers may give incentives to employees to participate in wellness programs, but they can't force them to or punish them if they don't. So actually, Tony Cosgrove probably doesn't have much of a legal leg to stand on. If we analogize taking moral enhancement pills, then it might be something employers, at least at this point in the law, could not require their employees to take, but might be able to give them rewards if they do so. Just as employees in jobs that affect public safety, for example, may be subject to more lifestyle requirements and restrictions than ordinary employees, perhaps the same would apply to people who work in jobs that require a high level of moral intuition. But what jobs are these? Judges, philosophy professors, clergy? How about parents in general? In part, the answer to these questions depend on how accessible the drug is. For example, will health insurance pay for it? Well, if it's regarded as an enhancement of the classic answer has been no. Just like the insurance won't pay for Viagra, although President Clinton did order Medicaid to pay for it in 1996, until certain politicians discovered that some sex offenders were also getting Medicaid to pay for their Viagra prescriptions, and they stopped that practice. On the other hand, as we heard from Jeffrey, the trend towards medicalizing everything that we can give someone a pill for, restless leg syndrome, male menopause, suggests that maybe being immoral will be deemed a mental illness once we have Banesto, and then we will be covering it under health insurance. In any event, the government could provide Banesto free of charge to us if the drug were deemed sufficiently beneficial. Finally, we come to the question of how the law will judge the behavior of people who do and don't take the pill. Let's assume taking the pill is voluntary, not required by the government. One alternative would be to hold them to a higher moral standard. In contrast, for example, to civilized countries, there's no legal duty in our country to rescue strangers, even if we can do so with no peril to ourselves, unlike the rest of the world, the civilized world, unlike the civilized world. Now, the law could impose a duty on people to rescue others if the people took the pill. In other words, if you take the pill, then you are under a legal duty to act more morally, including rescuing strangers. What's the problem with this approach? If the law took this approach, what's the problem? Well, the problem is it's classic legal conundrum. We would be discouraging people from taking the pill because then they would be held to a higher legal standard. And this is a fundamental dispute within the law. Do we hold people who invest in extra care or in obtaining extra abilities to be more careful or more considerate? Do we hold them to a higher standard of care? Do we punish them, in some sense, for having taken those steps, for having improved themselves? The law's answer on this question is very unclear. What about criminal responsibility? Should someone who takes Sonesta and commits a crime be judged more or less harshly than someone who doesn't take the pill? It may be justifiable to treat them more harshly because they should know better, but again, treating them less harshly might be advisable to encourage more people to take the pill in the hopes that we would as a society be engaging in fewer antisocial behaviors. In part, the answer to this question may depend on how prevalent Sonesta use is within the population, how many people take it. If enough people are taking it, it will become a social norm, and those who don't take it and harm people might be considered at least criminally negligent. Another issue regards whether warfighters should be given this pill. We talked a little bit about this. Should we give them a pill to enhance their moral judgment in battle, or would this cause a breakdown in military discipline because they would excessively question orders? Likely to be an issue mostly in the gray areas of the application of things like the rules of engagement. Finally, what about business? The general legal rule, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that is the rule of caveat emptor. Buyer beware. Okay? Don't expect a business person, the used car salesman, to tell you what's wrong with the used car she's trying to sell you. Well, what would happen to market theory if sellers took Sonesta and felt moral compunction about cheating buyers? There is a legal model for this. It was mentioned earlier today. Doctors and lawyers, for example, are held to be fiduciaries for patients and clients. They're supposed to subordinate their own self-interest to the interests of those whom they serve. Well, arguably, an entire market system could be created in which everyone was a fiduciary for everyone with whom they did business. In fact, I've often wondered why this isn't our general rule of law in this country. Well, what if only some business people took Sonesta? Well, perhaps, as was suggested by a question yesterday, there could be a seal of approval by the better business people. And finally, we come to the question about what about international dimensions? And there'll be more talk about this in a moment, I think, but just to sort of think about this a little bit, it would be, of course, good to reduce war crimes. If international leaders took Sonesta, there might be fewer war crimes. It might be good to, if they were able to become more empathetic towards others. This is the World War I poster against the Hun. You see how he is depicted. On the other hand, the international system might be vulnerable to state actors who refuse to take Sonesta. And so the question is, what would our solution be to this? Well, one solution would be an all-powerful international policeman, but then we'd have to make sure that the policeman was acting morally. Now, Ron Arkin and others have proposed that we could install software that would make lethal autonomous robots moral. Wendell and others have questioned whether this is realistic. So perhaps the best solution is to call on moral mouse once again. Thank you very much.
Okay, our final speaker of the day, and if he finishes in a timely fashion, we'll squeeze in a little Q&A, which is very little. James Giordano, who comes to us from the Center for Neurotechnology Studies at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies in Arlington, Virginia, and he's also affiliated with Ludwig Maximilian University.
Thank you. Thanks, Gustav, for inviting me. Thank you for you all for hanging in here. I'm looking out over to see you face something a while. It's almost 5 o'clock, New York City, Sunday afternoon. Nice part about it is this is New York City, and so I don't have to apologize for my accent. And so in batting cleanup, one of the things that I'm asked to do is to really pose this as a question. The issue here this week was the moral brain. And so first of all, you have to ask the question, is there such a thing as a moral brain? Number two, you have to then say, well, is morality something that's universalizable and current? And number three, you then have to say, let's not succumb to Icarus's folly, but to make sure we really know what we're doing with the neuroscience and neurotechnology at hand, and can it in some way be useful to assess the construct of morality, perhaps assess it, maybe even target it and intervene it and do so in a way that may be relevant and of value to this issue of global relations relations and national security policies, not just ours, but writ large on the scale of perhaps an international discourse that is really more dialectical and somewhat more cosmopolitan. I'm sure I deal with, of course, I also work with Bill Shakespeare quite a lot. And so, after these past couple of days, I don't have to convince you of this, do I? I mean, we've really pretty much gone, this is what I think it looks like, this is what we think it looks like, we can do something like this, and if we think it looks like this, we could probably intervene here. And so clearly one of the things that's happened is there's been an interesting set of heuristics that have allowed the translation of technology to theory, and theory to technology. To do what we like to talk about is the idea of assessing or identifying, accessing, and then ultimately perhaps targeting, intervening. Well, we've heard a lot of these things with regard to how neuroscience and neurotechnology have in some ways allowed putative assessments at a variety of different levels. All of these are to some degree or another technologically related. We've dealt with neuroimaging, these lovely pictures that we see over and over and over again. You can't swing a wet rope over your head these days without seeing these pictures of this, which sort of leads to this Wittgensteinian picture thinking idea that brains are color-coded for easy ID, and there are only really 4 colors of neurons there, which is not really the case. Neurogenomics perhaps sets up the same type of thing. There are 5 genes to control your behavior. They all do X, Y, and Z, but of course we know that's not the case. We heard earlier about oxytocin. And the idea is that these ligands, these nerve chemicals, as well as a variety of drugs like Onessa and albumine or whatever else you want to call it, may in fact work with receptors, but the idea here is that those receptors are plastic and that they do particular things that are bifurcated. Good environments that have particular sensitivities and bad environments that have others. So we have to intervene here not only on the genomic population individual level, but also on the level of proteomics and phenotypics. The idea of individually assessing, a personalized neuroscience. And is that in fact, in some way, translation viable? Can we go from anatomy and physiology to populational variances, and then even plotting out, as you heard Fabrice, individual trajectories and what that means? The answer is not whether or not we can actually do this. On some level, we certainly can, and I'm here to tell you that the pendulum swing is moving ever more in that direction. There's a big schism between what we can do and what we should do, and what we should do with the things we can. And that's interesting, because each and all of these approaches that you've heard over the past couple of days that deal with the question of the moral brain have looked at this as a variety of input points for assessment, access, and ultimately targeting and intervention. The idea of understanding that this represents a schematic diagram of the embodied brain embedded with its environment is important to understand because it also communicates to you a relative inextricability. I've been a neuroscientist for 30 years. I have not seen brains just walking around out there. I've sat at plenty of bars, grew up in New York City, and that's still to see an amygdala sitting at a table doing what amygdalas do. Last time I checked, they're embodied in people, and those people are embodied within environments. And that brings up the socio-cultural issue. Now we have to throw out the issue of culture as both a medium, like a petri dish, gives rise to what? Genotypes, phenotypes, and a forum that allows the expression of particular phenotypes by interacting and engaging with a variety of factors that ultimately incorporate and produce, by a variety of attractors and constraints, body-brain and brain-mind, with a little tilde in between. And this is a symbol for complementarity. This is not either or, it's both and. And certainly here this represents a true functional triad. And then these are embedded. And these outputs that affect environments that feed back. Well, that's what we're really dealing with when we deal with the moral brain. So, I pose this question. How then do we address neuroethics in the first tradition, which is really the cognitive neuroscience, of the neural basis and substrates of morality? We have to first, of course, define what morality is and recognize that there may not be a common morality, despite some of the arguments of the late Bernard Gert, who seem to argue that there may be some, and certainly alluding to some of the work of our colleague here in New York at Rockefeller University, Dr. Dunlop, who talks about the neurobiology of the golden rule. This is still interpretable, but that's really not what we're looking at. The work that's being done by my group and the ones we work with, both at the Center for Neurotech Studies at Potomac and ongoing the N3P3 project, something called the Neurotech 2020 project, really looks at what are we studying. Let's cut to the chase. Let's take sort of an eidetic reduction and ask what we're really dealing with when we look at this first tradition of the neuroscience of morality. That's not really what's happening. We're really looking at something called neuroecology. And here's a wonderful $25 definition for it. I don't have to read it for you, but I think it reduces nicely to this. It is the cognitive neuroscience of resource and relational evaluation and decision-making, which then we, as humans embedded in our culture and time and place, call that morality. We can look back historically and understand that the canon of morality has not necessarily been constant. Things that are morally acceptable today were not morally acceptable 50 years ago. One can take a look at the DSM-5, for example, and see that shifts in our criteria of what we consider normal or abnormal, ordered or disordered, also reflect, as Thomas Sass suggested, a social dimension that is defined within these working constructs. But there is something useful here, because this ecology provides for us a proto-moral sense. How do we engage in these cognitions that are engaged in niche stability, niche activation? Who are we living with? Under what conditions? What are those interactions and dynamics? So our argument is that this first tradition of neuroethics qua neuroecology, if you will, has some value, has some putative value, in that it allows us insights wholly consistent with those philosophical tenets of science to be self-critical and self-revisionist, lest we succumb to being anachronistic and, heaven forbid, dogmatic. We don't want to do that. It affords possible insights to these moral predispositions, cognitions, emotions, and behaviors, and then provides us some of the whys and hows that some of these ethical systems that we've heard of, deontology, utilitarianism, communitarianism, and certainly how agents interact, agentic ethics, such as virtue, may in fact have been developed based upon where individuals and groups find themselves, the nature of those interactions, and it provides something of a gestalt view to say, how is it that embodied brains that are embedded within their various cultures may in fact do this? But there are key issues here. Just by stating that, I open up a proverbial Pandora's box into issues and problems that arise from the intersection of the use of neuroscience and technology within the social realm to create definitions and to act upon them. And this is the working caveat. Because what this really bespeaks for us is this Janusian vision. Oh, sure. On one side, I can come back and say, look what this allows us to do. We can create things like honesta and don't be mean, and look at the nucleus deontologicus of Kant. There isn't such a thing, by the way. And so if we interact there and stimulate there and get a living that works there, we can all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But of course, you also recognize that we can take this just in the opposite direction. We can withhold those things and say, you shouldn't be nice to each other. You're killing yourself so we can win. Or I can look at those very same loci and substrates and say, if we can make it, we can break it. And look, let's face it, for those of you in the audience who know me, I'm the guy, this is the group. I mean, let's leave Bill Casey out of the picture because he works for a government agency, so he can't make any claim that I don't work for a government agency. I'm the guy who, with our staff, looked at the weaponization of neuroscience and neurotechnology. I get known as the neuroweapon guy. So here I am standing before you as Mephistopheles saying, yeah, there's a bad side here too. Is there a dark side? Yeah. And look, and I really advocate neuroscientific research towards the idea of national security. Because we have to know what these things can do. You don't want to be caught unprepared. And if we don't do it, perhaps someone else would. And that would leave us with a knickers around my knees. That's a neuroscientific term. And you don't want to be caught in it. For heaven's sake, do it right. And this really brings us to this whole area of neuroscience and technology we call neuro-S&T. Does it have great capabilities as the science progresses to engage and affect human performance by interacting with putatively identified substrates and mechanisms, recognizing that these change periodically, and the more we know, the more we can do? You heard it. You were here over the past few days. Absolutely. Is this, in fact, this Janusian vision, which in fact could be both good and bad? Sure it is. Is this attractive in agendas of international security, intelligence, and defense? Of course. Why? Because like any science and technology that's cutting edge, those are rapidly uptaking in such agendas. Historicity will bear out that canon, and you only have to look at the past 50 to 100 years, and certainly look at this throughout history, even in antiquity. Why would you think that neuroscience and neurotechnology would be any different? It won't. The question is, what are we going to do with this power? So what we see is that the brain then becomes this opportunistic target. Oh yes, certainly it's this way medically, it's certainly this way in public life, and you've heard much of that. make better children, have parents love their kids, can I be moral? But let's not extricate these individual and group cohort ideas from the larger social milieu. From the idea that the architectonics of the world stage have shifted through science and technology, and the village that it may take is now one that exists on the world stage. We're dealing with a global shift. And so what we really see here is the potential to engage neuroscience in ways that may avoid or may incur some potential to make mistakes with regard to individual, group, and population analysis, assessment, ontologies, as you heard from Fabrice. How will we leverage this? What will we do with this? Well, you've seen this slide before. Actually, I saw this hammer slide just a moment ago, so this appears to be a very common metaphor. What is this? This is a tool, just as neuroscience and neurotechnology is a tool. How do I move forward? By recognition that this is a tool. There's a lot of things I can do with this. I can use this to hammer nails. I can use this as a sculptor to create great works of art and do good things, or I can use this to bash you over the head with it. Same tool, perhaps even the same person, different circumstances. And here we see the problem of tool use. The first problem is the reduction to the idea of all tools require substrates. If I have a hammer, then everything seems to be a nail. If what I say is the only tool in my toolkit is neuroscience and neurotechnology, then people are their brains. But moreover, I can weaponize this. And I recognize that, in fact, this is weaponizable, and I have to be aware of that as well. And as a result, I then get into this second tradition of neuroethics, which looks at the ethical issues that arise in and from neuroscientific and neurotechnological use, potential misuse, abuse, in a variety of circumstances, including global security, intelligence, and defense. And the idea of how policies, regulations, guidelines, and perhaps direction in governments should, in fact, be fostered and generated with a real sensitivity to the power that comes from dealing with these issues that may be able to span from the synaptic to the self to the social. Not only the actual power of assessment and ontological characterization, but then, of course, the idea that from those assessments come the capacity to access and target. And so, really, we have to take a look at this first tradition, neuroecology called neuromorality, and say, what does this teach us about the way we may be able to use these technologies and our ethics? And then how do we embrace that knowledge in such a way as to regulate what we do with this? And this bespeaks my idea that there is an interfluence, there's a reciprocity that exists with this tool of neuroscience and perhaps its instruction book, neuroethics. A fairly new field, but I say it's not one that is just nascent, I think it's one that's growing. These two traditions may in fact be self-contained. There's a lens that goes here that looks at organisms in terms of how they develop ecologically towards these ideas of morality, but who are we really looking at? Now, we can look at a lot of different species, and certainly we have. We also need to turn that lens around and look at ourselves. It's also a mirror that allows us this basis of assessment and allows us to take a cold, hard look without the fibbing of mirror, mirror, who's up on the wall, who's the fairest. But really, mirror, mirror that we have in our hands is also a lens. Let's look at ourselves and what we can and cannot do and should not do with a higher level of intensity and granularity. I pose that in these two traditions working together, neuroethics may provide something of a metaethics. Not the metaethics, but there's a value statement that qualifies this. It is valuable and of some validity if and only if, two F's, it is nested within a biopsychosocial model. And not just this cheesy new age biopsychosocial thing. I mean a strict Hegelian biopsychosocial model that acknowledges that the organisms have a biological basis, that are embedded within their social constructs, conditions, and constraints, and that this interaction bidirectionally fosters psychological variables, outflows, experiences, and expressions that in fact then affect both the biology and the social milieu. This is the dynamic interventional model. This is a dynamic bidirectional model, and it's one that's nested deeply within systems theory that I advocate very, very strongly. And I think there's a reality check that goes along here with this, because what it allows us to do is to examine those complex interactions not only at the biopsychological level, but how we then use that information as well as the tools we've gotten that information with and use as targets to understand how the social milieu may in fact feed back upon them. So what am I hoping to do here? Well, I think if we take a look at this type of neuroethics in practice, perhaps towards global relations, global security, it may provide for us some insight into the neurobiopsychosocial constants, similarities, and variances that we as peoples have. It may allow us to look at others and say, I recognize that we may have particular things in common, but I also recognize that there are things that may differ as a consequence of both biology and its embeddedness and influence because of the environment in which perhaps you grew up in versus I grew up in. It allows a much broader picture that is not exclusive of the social sciences, but is inclusive and shines a particular light that is both bottom-up and top-down. And in that way, it has been posed, may build a bridge, or may build, as we see here, multiple bridges between the good territory on this side and Brooklyn. But that's the idea. But I'm going to go one step further than that. Because I think, although it sounds lovely to build bridges, and look, it's a sunny day, and there's a little cloud, and look how calm the water is, that's false. Because I think this really takes some keen insight and discipline. One of the things that's important to understand about both neuroscience and neuroethics is that it mandates ongoing assessment and revision of what is known about the brain, what is not known about the brain, how we know this, and what that means. It dictates an appreciation of the knowledge we have, as well as the knowledge we lack. It demands that pragmatism in practice. It equally demands, as I've advocated, for a very strong Arendtian stance. Homo faber, not anima laborans. You don't put your head to the grindstone and work, suddenly come up and go, woo! What have we done? But rather, reflection, insight, some type of assessment with each and every step along the way, recognizing limitations, as well as what delimitations could do when loosed on the reality of the social environment. It ain't building a bridge. It's digging through rock to build a tunnel to the other side. What is this bedrock? This bedrock are those very things that we're studying. The biases that we understand exist in the Bayesian brain as a consequence of environmental embeddedness and the circumstances that dictate particular needs and values. The technological imperative and mechanistic paradox that compel us to use the technology at hand, even though we have partial knowledge of what this does. The fact that very often we do stick our head in the sand and go, well, perhaps just a precautionary principle, only to be surprised when some other group, individual, or culture says we don't adhere to your precautionary principle and creates science and technology that's then leveraged in some way that may be deleterious. We have to break through. We have to chisel through this rock in a way that is constructive and that is cooperative. And I feel the sense of optimism and pragmatism that I share with my colleague Bill Casey. I too am an optimist. Why? Because if in fact neuroscience is indeed the next big science, as advocated perhaps by individuals of our government or on the world stage, for example, the voice of Zach Lembios here in the United States, UNESCO, World Health Organization, Royal Academy. As we heard in the Nuffield report, that in fact neuroscience and its technologies are the looking glass to the future because it allows insight to self and others, then I think we have to be able to say that neuroethics might be the thing we need to unpack that is the instruction book that allows us to leverage this biopsychosocially with human ecology, to assess those potential trajectories and balances that may be of value, those that may be preventable when they're not, those that once let out of the proverbial bag might be retractable, those things that are recuperable, and perhaps those things that are forgivable or not, and to move forward with that sense of preparedness. It's a huge responsibility. More now, I think, than ever. The world is on our shoulders, and our head is right in the middle of it. No pun intended. Because that's where we're focused. This is the neural basis of X, this is the neural basis of Y. My brain made me do it. It's our brains that did. The brain is guilty. Frye standards, Galbraith standards, international standards, etc. There's huge, huge capability of this knowledge to be able to intuit what brains in people in environments do. With this knowledge comes great power. How will we use this? In ways that are, in fact, technically right, as well as ethical, legally, and socially sound, not only for us, but because we get a much better sense of purchase and leverage for humans as species that are nested within particular niches that may differ and create distinctions as well as commonalities? Or, in fact, do we become in some way irresponsible and avoid the fact that we need to recognize these limitations? And what I claim here is very simple, that this type of movement ahead dictates scientifically informed ethics and ethically informed policy. Obviously, this has to be grounded in reality of all of us can do. I think there's something of Delphic invocation that goes along here. And I think this might be the marching orders for neuroscience and its instruction in neuroethics. Perhaps what's old is new. We've gone back to the future. In antiquity, for wisdom, they would go to the pillars of Delphi and ask the oracle, tell me what's up. Well, perhaps here, this is what we're doing. And perhaps what comes back is the answer from neuroscience and neuroecology, neuromorality, and neuroethics in its reciprocal bifurcate, yet complementarity of traditions. Know thyself. As humans, as biopsychosocial organisms, as scientists, as policymakers, as ethicists, and know your limits. The limits of the understanding, the limits of interpretation, the limits of application. It's critical. At our fingertips, we have neuroscience that allows us to hold the essence of what we may be, at least in part, in our hands. What's that fun? This work has been funded in part by the Fulbright Foundation, the N3P3 project of Ludwig Maximilian University, the ongoing support of the Center for Neurotechnology Studies. If you like the slides, don't thank me. My wife's a genius with this. These are some things that might equate you to what we've been talking about here, and you can get in touch with me. That's where I live.